I'm Sam Roberts of the New York Times, and welcome to the New York Times Close Up. The deadline for voting is over. The city's first ranked choice election. The mayoral candidates made their final push to get out the vote, glad handing, even hula hooping throughout the city. Catherine Garcia and Andrew Yang campaigned together in a loose alliance. Eric Adams leading in votes at this time, but his victory far from guaranteed. The counting of votes in this ranked choice system is complex, and on top of that, over 200,000 absentee votes may not be counted until next week. It's still unclear who the Democratic candidate for mayor will be, in all likelihood the next mayor of New York City. But as she wrote in a recent opinion piece, this foregone Democratic political victory poses a problem for our city. Mara Gay, member of the editorial board of the Times, writes that one-party elections hardly make New York the Shangri-La of democracy. Also on today's program, Jeff Mays, a Metro political reporter with the Times. He's been following not only the primary results from both parties, but the race for controller, a race with its own set of intrigue. Both Mara Gay and Jeff Mays join us for today's program, and welcome to both of you. Mara, anything surprise you in the race results that we have found so far? We have obviously Eric Adams in the lead by a 10-point margin, with Maya Wiley right behind him, and then right behind her we have the other candidates lined up in an order that we can't quite figure out until the rest of the votes are counted.
That's right, Sam. We have a lot of surprises here. I think the first big surprise is that turnout is actually higher than anticipated. We may hit over 1 million votes. And I think that's great. We can do a lot better, a whole lot better, but that's significantly better than we did in 2013, when I think something like 623,000 New Yorkers cast ballots in the primary. So that's a win for everybody. Greater participation in a year in which it was very difficult to be a New Yorker in general, day to day. And then on top of that, you have progressives, I believe, actually outdoing expectations, outperforming expectations, which were quite low heading into this election. You saw a lot of energy for Maya Wiley in the mayor's race, despite what was, for the most of the election, I believe, a quite lackluster campaign. She pulled it together at the end, and there was some real energy, specifically in Brooklyn, coalescing around her campaign. And then you saw Garcia as well do very well, but ultimately that kind of progressive center-left coalition seemed to split. And so that seems to have handed Eric Adams a likely victory, but we'll have to see in the weeks ahead.
Jeffrey, why do you think Eric Adams did as well as he did? Why that appeal sort of across a fairly broad spectrum that made him win with a reasonably high percentage given the number of candidates?
Well, I think, Eric Adams pursued a strategy very early on of going after Black, Latino, and working class New Yorkers. He focused on an issue like crime and public safety, which, certain neighborhoods, people were seeing a rise in shootings and homicides. So he very early on went after those people. Throughout his rhetoric, throughout the campaign, he often talked about, "I'm one of you." He leaned very heavily on his biography of, growing up poor in Brooklyn, Queens. Said he was abused by police at 15, and then decided to join the police department, where, of course, he was a very vocal critic of the police department. So, when I was out talking to voters, I heard time and time again, I think he speaks for us. I think he understands what my sons are going through. And so that was a strategy that he pursued very strongly and very successfully from the initial results.
Mary, you wrote about this being a one-party town. Obviously, the Democratic Party, the Republican primary, I don't want to say was something of a joke, but it came close to it. But there was a pretty wide range of ideology or at least platforms within the Democratic Party, wasn't there?
Sure, I think that's to be expected in a town, in a country in which the Republican Party has radicalized itself in New York into irrelevance. Joe Lhota, the former mayoral candidate for the Republicans in 2013, who lost to Mayor de Blasio, of course, said it best last night. He was on New York One, and he said, well, I'm a Democrat now. The Republican Party has to rebuild itself, but it's really not my problem. And I think that really shows you how far the Republicans have moved in a city that is increasingly majority minority, increasingly liberal, even among white voters. The Republican Party has a lot of work to do. My hope is actually that they do some of that work because we really need competitive elections are, I think, good for democracy and good for the city. But in the meantime, that's why you see so much energy in a Democratic primary in New York City. And it is a big tent. And so in some ways, this was kind of like a brawl at a family reunion. You saw all kinds of different factions making themselves heard. I think there's a huge difference too in the way New Yorkers are living day to day on the Upper West Side versus in East Flatbush, where Eric Adams did very well. So you see those differences. You see differences not only along race lines and class lines, but also generationally. I believe if you were to look at a map of voters who rent their homes versus own, you might see some interesting data there as well. So I think all in all, we're doing okay in New York, and we have an opportunity to keep keep making our elections more competitive and have a stronger city as a result.
Obviously, in the Republican primary, the two candidates took themselves seriously. But if you look at serious Republicans in the party, I don't think they would consider those two candidates as seriously as people who have run in the past. Did Joe Lhota say who he had voted for in the Democratic primary?
Joe Lhota was a pretty vocal supporter of Catherine Garcia. He was at Garcia's party last night, and I'm not sure what he did down ballot, but in his own words, he's a Democrat now.
Jeff, what is the city council going to look like starting in January? I guess it's going to be a lot more liberal than it has been before. And what does that bode for the next mayor?
Well, it's going to be interesting. You know, there were about 6 candidates that the DSA, the Democratic Socialists, supported. I mean, it looks like right now, at least 2 of them look like they're going to win their race. Tiffany Caban, who was the very left-leaning candidate in Queens, who ran for Queens District Attorney on a very progressive platform. It looks like she might win. You know, so the big question is is there a push for her to try to become speaker? How will that look if you have Eric Adams as mayor, who's talking about that you can use stop and frisk legally and wants to reinstitute the plainclothes, you know, gun and gang squads. And then you have a city council speaker, maybe someone like Tiffany Caban. There's going to be a lot of fireworks there, a lot of fighting, a lot of, you know, maneuvering to try to figure out that position. And, you know, to Mara's point, you know, if you look at the Democratic Party right now, it almost in some ways feels like 2 parties in some ways. You have, you know, sort of these centrist Democrats like Eric Adams and even Catherine Garcia, Andrew Yang, you know, 3 out of the 4 leading candidates for mayor were very centrist. And then you had the progressive side of the party, which was represented by Maya Wiley. It almost makes you wonder what would have happened if Scott Stringer, if his campaign had not imploded and progressives had united around him, would we have seen somewhat of a different result tonight?
And what can we say about the other 2 citywide candidates for controller and for public advocate? How do they come into play in the politics of what's going to happen in January?
Well, you know, Jumaane Williams ran away with it as expected. He's been a progressive stalwart, so he's definitely a star of the progressive movement. And then for controller, we saw Brad Lander, who right now on the first ballot has about maybe an 8-point lead over Corey Johnson, who's the council speaker. You know, Corey was able to line up the labor unions behind him. You know, he was once a leading candidate for mayor before jumping to the comptroller's race. But Brad Lander really lined up the progressive movement behind him. He got an endorsement from Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Senators Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren also endorsed him. So some national progressive movement there. So, I think he did a lot better than a lot of people expected. A lot of people did not expect him to be leading at this first ballot. So that would be a real victory for the progressive movement if he were to take that election.
Mara, what do you think the big variables in this election were? We were trying to figure that out, obviously, before the voting. Was it the debates? Was it race? Was it gender? Was it money? One of the things that was really striking that you were concerned about, obviously, as an opinion writer before the election was the power of money, particularly in the race for Manhattan District Attorney.
Yeah, I think it's too soon to tell exactly what it was that motivated voters. It may have been a confluence of events depending on which voters you're talking about. But I do believe that, for example, the Manhattan DA race, as you said, Sam, Tali Weinstein put in over 8 million of her own money at the end, trying to win that hard fought race. And it looks like Alvin Bragg has bested her anyway. I think that says a few things. One of those things I would like to say is hopefully, that newspaper endorsements still matter. We endorsed Alvin Bragg. We also endorsed, of course, Brad Lander. I think the other thing is that the mood in the city among, I believe, core Democratic Black voters who are a little bit older is fiercely protective of their quality of life, of candidates who speak for them, who they believe understand what they're going through in this city and have been going through. I think city workers and Black and brown communities in this city are suffering like they haven't suffered in a generation. And they showed up to the polls to make sure that their interests were protected and heard, their voices were heard. And I really believe that's the dominant theme of this election, followed by a real and true groundswell of progressive energy that I think we'll see and hear a lot more from in the years ahead as the progressive bench grows deeper in the city council and elsewhere.
Jeff, were you surprised at how much both Andrew Yang and Scott Stringer fizzled at the end? Andrew Yang obviously was deemed the front runner for months. Did people finally conclude that he was an empty suit? And Scott Stringer, did people rush to judgment, the Working Families Party included, on the basis of one person who came forward with allegations? And was that, in effect, a fair thing for them to do?
Well, yeah, I think there was a thought that the progressive movement maybe jumped too early in abandoning Scott. AOC revealed yesterday that she ranked Scott second on her ballot after endorsing Maya Wiley. And Maya was really the third choice of progressives. They went from Scott to Diane, and finally they settled on Maya very late in the process. So yeah, I'm not that surprised that Scott did not do as well. Those accusations against him were very damaging, took up a lot of the media space, and he had to answer those questions about those allegations at all of the debates. I am surprised that Andrew Yang did fall as far as he did. I know that there seemed to me, when I talked to voters, there seemed to be a dissonance in the polls and what people actually thought about him when I talked to him. And there were a lot of concerns about whether he actually knows enough to run the city, is serious enough to run the city. And so I think that was what was reflected yesterday in the polls. And given the fact that you did have this energy from Blacks and Latinos in the city who, as Mara said, are suffering, are struggling. The coronavirus, the pandemic really exposed a lot of these issues that are by no means new, but they're hitting people in a way that they haven't felt in a long time. So I think those voters really came out, really showed their strength in the primary yesterday.
Something that Jeff, that you were talking about with Yang, I mean, I don't know the answer to this. This is very anecdotal, but I do believe it may have been a mistake for Yang to hit Adams as hard as he did. I don't know how many voters were watching the debates, but ultimately Yang was competing for the same voters, or many of the same voters, as Eric Adams. And I think for older establishment Black Democratic voters to see Eric Adams kind of come under attack by Andrew Yang was probably a significant turnoff. And Yang was never going to win the Progressive Coalition. So I think he may have actually shot himself in the foot by alienating many of his respective voters. He was talking about crime, but he went too far. I think he was not just talking about crime and what he was going to do, he was just attacking Eric Adams in the debates in some really visceral and in sometimes troubling ways. And I think that may have really turned some voters off.
And campaigning with Catherine Garcia certainly must have helped Garcia more than it helped Yang.
That's right.
Thank you to Mara Gay and Jeff Mays of the New York Times. And coming up next, the city's uneven economic recovery. Welcome back. Through April of this year, the city had lost nearly 12% of its jobs. A report from the Center for New York City Affairs found that 600,000 people have been out of work for more than 6 months. There are promising signs as more people take to the streets, restaurants and stores, and pandemic restrictions are almost fully lifted. But how might the city's economy be reshaped by the pandemic? Will the numbers rise to pre-pandemic levels once tourists return in full force? Joining us to talk about this is Patrick McGeehan, Metro reporter for the New York Times, co-author with Nelson Schwartz and Nicole Hung of a recent front page story on the lagging rebound. Patrick, why are we lagging? New York lost the greatest share of jobs among the 20 largest cities, as we said, nearly 12%, and also lagging in regaining jobs. Why is that?
Well, New York has some unique issues. One being that it's got such a high concentration of office workers, people working in tall office buildings, almost all of whom have not come back to work and are only slowly trickling back now. And then the city's also very dependent on tourism, and there hasn't really been any tourism to speak of until the last month or so.
So how do we get past that, especially when the likelihood is that a lot of people are going to continue to be working remotely, and subway ridership still somewhere less than half of what it was? Are we ever going to reach those pre-pandemic levels?
Well, it's certainly going to take a long time. It's going to be a slog back, and it's in doubt whether we'll get back to the levels we were at. I mean, the city was booming going into this pandemic. Everything was hitting on all cylinders. Employment was at an all-time high. Unemployment was at an all-time low. Everything was working, and then everything came to a complete halt. And some of the things that the city is most dependent on, like Broadway as a draw, have been gone for more than a year and aren't coming back until the fall. So it's only now starting to shape up so that we can see what it might be like on the other side of the pandemic. But everything isn't coming back to the way it was within the next couple of years, particularly the office work scenario.
We see some, little signs, and they're not necessarily indicative of major changes, but Philip Morris just announced this past week that it's moving its U.S. headquarters to Fairfield County in Connecticut, in part because so many people are working remotely. That's only a couple of hundred jobs, but is that indicative of what's likely to happen more often? And then if so, what happens to all that unoccupied vacant office space?
Well, that is the big fear. The big fear is that there'll be an exodus there hasn't been one yet. And what we're seeing now is a kind of a rallying. Particularly the Wall Street firms, the big banks, are calling their workers back to the office and telling them that there really isn't any reason for them not to return. So we're seeing sort of the push now to prevent, head off any kind of exodus like the city suffered back in the 70s. But there's still going to be the issue of a lot of people wanting to work from somewhere else. And the more workers who don't want to return to an office in New York City, the more likely it is that their employers are going to be rethinking the setup that they have.
Is there any way to capitalize on that, to turn that office space into something more productive, whether it's apartments or anything else?
Well, that's going to be tricky, right? For instance, there are a lot of hotels in New York that closed. Most of them have reopened recently, but not all of them. And, immediately people think, well, can a hotel be converted into an apartment building? Not as easily as one might suspect, because there are lots of issues with plumbing, kitchens, the kinds of things that people need in an apartment. Office buildings have the same issue largely. I mean, the buildings that have been converted in New York City successfully are mostly older buildings, right? That have, I would say better bones, I guess you'd say. So these modern office towers that are kind of glass sheathed towers, they don't make for the best. I mean, their best use is office buildings. So converting them is going to be difficult. The New York's best hope is that the majority of these workers all end up back working in offices again.
And also there's a question of how many of these you can convert. What's the impact been, or is there any indication that things are bouncing back in terms of residential real estate prices?
Residential starting to come back. I mean, there was this moment, right, that quite a few people took advantage of, where rents were falling and real estate prices were falling. You could get what you might think was a deal on a place in New York, but already we're seeing that window is kind of closing, and prices are starting to rise again. I don't think that will be New York's issue, that people don't want to live in New York. I think the issue will be, do people want to work in New York?
And what about safety in terms of living in New York or working in New York? How big a factor is that likely to be in people making a decision?
Well, I do feel like the safety issue is paramount, and it's being played up by the business community, to some extent for political reasons. We were in the midst of a mayoral campaign, but crime is not out of control or anything. It's just that it's on the rise. It's coming off the very lowest levels in recent history. So again, we're not living through the 70s again, and there isn't really any sign that's where we're headed. But there is a great deal of concern. There's a lot of attention being paid to shootings and the kinds of crimes that are being reported in New York. But I don't think that's going to be a big deterrent to the city recovering.
The feds are obviously helping the short-term recovery of the city in terms of the budget and of the fiscal matters. What's going to happen when that money runs out?
Well, that's another great question, Sam, because right now we're awash in money, right? I mean, people think, oh, New York took such a big hit, it must be suffering financially. The opposite is true. At the moment, there's plenty of money. The tax collections have been up. Lots of Wall Street had a great year last year. There's a lot of money in the city right now. A lot of it came in these big packages from the federal government. It won't be here forever. How it's spent is going to be very important. Certainly, the next mayor is going to want to have more say in that. But the city's using it for things like a big tourism campaign to try to get tourists to come back. On the other side of this pandemic, there are going to be more fiscal problems and more concern about how the city's spending its money and whether it's spending too much.
Is there anything the next mayor can do that would really make a difference?
Oh, I think there are plenty of things that the next mayor can do. I do think that that being a cheerleader for the city is really important. I think that sending a message that New York is back, that this isn't the 70s redux. I think those are very important actions that the mayor can take. But I also think that spending the money wisely on things like retraining workers. Oh, there are a lot of displaced workers still. We have more than 500,000 people still dislocated from this pandemic. Job training, promotion of the city. Those are going to be very important things that they have to get right.
Quick question, very quick. Why can't you get a cab?
There's a shortage of cab drivers and private vehicle drivers. You know, a lot of people haven't come back to work, and they don't want to come back to work until they know they can make a living.
Fair enough. Pat McGeehan of the New York Times, thanks for joining us. And for the New York Times and CUNY TV, I am Sam Roberts.